Cole's Quilts. And I am here in my not yet completed sewing studio because I went to record a video in my old sewing room and I filled it up with so much stuff. There's really no place for me to record. So anyways, this is the first video of the Tree Frog Quilt Along. I'm going to put this video out before the Quilt Along starts, and one of the reasons for that is because I'm hoping that what I go over in this video will help you make decisions about how you plan to go about this Quilt Along, which might involve you finding some fabric that you don't have or something like that, so we have a little bit of time to do that. So I'm going to explain what the blocks are going to look like, and then I'm going to explain the 3 different ways that you could go about doing this Quilt Along. By the way, sorry about the lighting. They put lights in, but they are all undone right now because they were going to paint the ceiling. So I just have this creepy ring light. All right, so the first block I'm going to show you is a block that's all one section. And it's all also one part of the frog. So like I showed you in the first video, I have an image that's going to go in the pattern. It looks like this. It shows you the different parts of the frog. So you can see, also going to label it on the block. So it'll say frog body or frog face. And so this block is all part of the frog's body. So you'll notice when you look at these colors, a lot of them are very similar. So there's 3 ways you could go about this. One is to just go by the letters. This says LYG, which stands for light yellow green. But notice that there are multiple light yellow greens and they don't all look the same. So the idea is that, there's like a spectrum of colors and light yellow green is like an area of that spectrum, but there's still a spectrum within it. For example, here are some fabrics that I pulled out for this. I would say that this is yellow green and this is yellow green and this is yellow green. Now I would say this is probably more like a medium yellow green because these are light. So if you look at this example, I put out a bunch of fabrics. I highly recommend taking a picture with your phone of your fabrics and then putting a black and white filter on it. And then you can compare that to the gray scale picture of the frog. So you can kind of see if the colors you have are more medium or light. If I'm just going by the letters, light, yellow, green, then anything that is within that range will work. Because the Scrappy Quilt is really designed for, like, if you have 2 that are both labeled LYG right next to each other, ideally you're not using the same fabric. So let's say I have these 3 fabrics that are all light yellow green. So maybe I'll use this one for one light yellow green, then I'll use this one, and maybe I'll alternate them. That creates some variety. So the goal of this pattern is to give you like a lot of creative freedom. The second way you could do it is you could look at that colored circle that I put on there. So you can look at the colored circle and you can hold fabric up to the colored circle and try to find a piece of fabric that matches it as close as possible. That's why I put those there. Some people have a hard time with that. And also one thing that's really important to understand is that if it doesn't match exactly, it's still going to work. It could be close enough, especially with the ones that are sort of muted neutrals. Like there's some neutrals that have some red tones, but if you just did neutral, it'd be fine. And then the third way you could do it is to just go by the different areas and what they are. So for example, if this whole block is all the frog's body and the frog's body is generally green, then you could just say, okay, this block needs to be all green. And you could just pick whatever greens you want. Whereas if you're doing a section where part of it is the frog's eye that is supposed to be red, then you can just say, okay, I'm going to use whatever red's there. And then I'll use whatever green's here. And that gives you like ultimate. One thing that I would not suggest, like I said, is to do all the body all the same green. You could, but you'll sort of lose that cool pixely kaleidoscope effect that the quilt has because like with this block, it's all green. So then you wouldn't even really need these pieces. You could just make it all one piece. I would recommend having at least 2 green pieces or 3 green pieces so you can alternate through them just so that you have a little bit more color going on. So when you have it as one piece, that's going to be pretty simple. Another thing I want to point out is when I have blocks that are divided into multiple pieces, I want to point out a few things that I have in the block to help you differentiate, to understand how to sew it back together, and to be able to figure out which part you're working on. So if we look at this block, you'll notice that we have 2 sections. What I've done is the seam allowance on most of my blocks in most of my block systems. I have a few different ways I do it. You'll notice there's this gray outline and there's a little dashed line showing that's where you should cut it. That's the seam allowance. So for this quilt along, that gray seam allowance is going to be the color of the seam allowance around the block. And then when we have sections within sections, the seam allowances will be different patterns. A lot of my patterns don't have a seam allowance when I split it into sections. That is usually because it would take up so much more paper. But in this pattern, not all of the blocks are split up, so I'm going to go ahead and put the seam allowance in. So if you look at this one, so you'll see lots of different textures, dots, stripes, stuff like that. And so if you were to print out 4 blocks and cut them up, not only will 2 sections of one block indicate which block they are by having the square saying like, oh, this is A1, maybe it's A1 section 1 and this is A1 section 2, but also the seam allowance patterns will match. So that will help you sort of eyeball how to connect that together. One other thing I want to point out is that I am using a color code to show the separation between different areas of the frog. So if we look at this block, part of the block is the frog's face and part of the block is the frog's eye. So there will be a blue line that will show you the separation between like the frog's face, the frog's eye, or maybe the frog's body and the frog's foot, or maybe the frog's head in the background. And then it'll be labeled in the seam allowance saying like, this is background and this is the frog body, so that you can then make the decisions you want to make about which fabrics you want to use. And here is an example of what that could look like. So the first blocks are going to come out on March 19th. This is the schedule of the quilt along. We're going to do about 4 blocks a week, like we did with the last quilt along. Remember that if you would like, you could buy a starter kit that has some of the basic shades that you might need to do this pattern. Also, I don't remember if I said it in my other videos. So I started offering thread in my quilt kits. I now have thread, seam ripper, and needles in many of my kits. I'm thinking about putting quilt labels that are like themed to go with the quilt in my quilt kits. So let me know if you guys are interested in that. I'm really excited. So we're almost done with the Castle Quilt Along. I'm really excited to see how everybody finishes those. It'll probably be a minute before I post the quilting on mine because I have a few quilts I have to finish long on me before that. When there's more progress on my quilting studio, I will show you guys. And I'm super excited about the Frog Quilt Along. Happy quilting.